There's a specific kind of quiet that falls over a room when a man's own words get handed back to him by someone he never expected to hear from again. I've been told about a moment like that by someone who watched it happen from a few feet away, and they described it to me as the fastest they'd ever seen a confident man run out of things to say. It started with a sentence a senior officer said without thinking twice about it, the kind of sentence that's said so casually it barely registers as an insult to the person saying it. And it ended with a radio transmission, a call sign nobody in that room expected to hear again, that made every single person there understand exactly how wrong he'd been, and exactly how publicly. If you love stories about old assumptions getting corrected by the very reputation they tried to dismiss, hit subscribe before we go any further, because that's exactly what this channel exists for. And tonight, I want you playing along with me. At some point in this story, before I say her call sign out loud, you're going to start guessing what it means. When it clicks, drop it in the comments. Let's go back to the beginning of that briefing, because you need to feel exactly how casually that comment was made before we get anywhere near that radio. Her name, for tonight's story, was Major Sarah Kincaid, 36 years old, recently transferred into a joint operational planning role at a base that, up until her arrival, had operated for years under the leadership of a colonel named Richard Voss, a man with a long career, real experience, and a set of assumptions about who belonged in a fighter cockpit that hadn't updated much in the last couple of decades. I want to be fair to the context here because I think it matters. Voss wasn't cartoonishly cruel. He was, by most accounts, a competent, experienced officer who had simply never had his assumptions seriously challenged, the specific kind of quiet, unexamined bias that survives for years in an environment where almost nobody around you has the standing or the inclination to push back on it directly. Sarah's arrival at that base wasn't, on the surface, especially dramatic. She'd transferred in to fill a planning role that, while genuinely important, wasn't a flying position, and in the initial paperwork and introductions, nothing about her assignment signaled anything that should have drawn particular attention from Voss or anyone else. But during a planning meeting roughly 2 weeks after her arrival, discussing an upcoming joint exercise that would involve coordinated fighter operations, Sarah offered a specific, technically detailed suggestion about tactical positioning that reflected a level of hands-on combat aviation knowledge considerably beyond what her current role would typically require. Voss, according to 2 people present in that meeting, responded to her suggestion with a tone that shifted quickly from mild surprise to something closer to dismissive amusement. "That's an interesting theory," he said, according to witnesses, "but this isn't really a combat jet role you're stepping into here. Women don't typically fly that side of the house, and there's a reason for that." A few uncomfortable, quiet laughs followed, the specific kind that happens when a senior officer says something dated, and nobody in the room quite knows whether to challenge it directly. Sarah, according to those same witnesses, didn't argue with him in that moment. She simply nodded, let the comment pass, and continued the meeting without pushing back, the calm, practiced restraint of someone who has heard a version of that particular sentence considerably more times in her career than she'd ever bother counting. Here's a question worth carrying with you while we go tonight. How many senior, experienced people do you think are still operating on assumptions that were never actually true, simply because nobody around them has had the specific opportunity to prove otherwise? Hold that thought. What Voss didn't know, because Sarah's current assignment gave him no particular reason to look deeper into her record, was that she had spent nearly a decade of her earlier career flying advanced fighter aircraft in genuine combat operations, accumulating a service record that, had he actually bothered to review it, would have made his comment in that meeting almost embarrassingly immediately wrong. She'd flown missions in some of the most demanding operational theaters her branch had assigned pilots to during that stretch of her career, earning a reputation, among the specific, tightly bound community of pilots who'd flown alongside her, as one of the sharpest tactical minds in her entire cohort. She'd earned a call sign during that period, the way these things usually happen, not chosen by her but given, after a specific mission that had left a lasting impression on the people who witnessed it. During an extraordinarily demanding combat sortie involving a rapidly deteriorating tactical situation, Sarah had executed with a level of precision and composure that had, among the small community of pilots who knew the story, made her name into something close to a legend, the specific, permanent kind of reputation that travels quietly through professional circles long after the person who earned it has moved into a different role entirely. None of that traveled with her into that planning meeting. All Voss saw was a mid-career officer in a support role, and in the absence of any louder reminder, his outdated assumption about who belonged in a combat cockpit went entirely unchallenged. For the following weeks, Sarah continued in her planning role exactly as she had before, giving no particular indication that Voss's comment had bothered her, or that she had any interest in correcting it directly. She simply kept doing her job, competently and quietly, the same restraint she'd apparently carried through more than one similar moment over the course of her career. That brings us to the joint exercise that changed everything. The exercise Sarah had been helping plan involved a complex, multi-aircraft coordination scenario, bringing together fighter squadrons from multiple commands to test exactly the kind of joint tactical response that real operational scenarios demand. On the day of the exercise itself, Voss was present in the operations center, overseeing the broader coordination, monitoring the exercise's progress alongside a room full of officers, including several visiting from other commands who had flown with considerably more diverse squadrons over the course of their own careers. About 20 minutes into the exercise, a genuine complication emerged, the kind that always seems to show up in exactly these stories, right when everyone least expects it. A real communication breakdown between two of the participating fighter elements, compounded by the simulated threat environment escalating faster than the exercise's own planning had built margin for, began fraying the coordination between multiple aircraft in exactly the way that, in a live combat scenario, costs people their lives. The operations center, listening to the increasingly tangled radio traffic, watched the exercise begin sliding toward genuine disorganization, several officers in that room, Voss included, growing visibly tense as the coordination between elements continued to deteriorate. And then, over that same crowded frequency, a voice cut through, calm and immediate, carrying an authority that made several of the visiting officers in that operations center sit up sharply, recognizing something in the exact cadence and confidence of that transmission before anyone had explained anything at all. It came from an aircraft that had joined the exercise partway through, flown by a visiting pilot participating from an entirely separate command, someone who had, unbeknownst to anyone in that base's operations center, once flown combat missions directly alongside Sarah years earlier, in the exact same tactical theater where she'd built the reputation nobody at this base currently knew anything about. "This is Ironwood. I have the formation. Everyone hold and follow my lead." I want you to sit in that moment with me, because according to two officers who were in that operations center, the room went almost instantly quiet. The specific silence of several experienced people simultaneously recognizing a call sign that clearly meant something considerably more significant than anyone locally understood. One of the visiting officers, according to witnesses, turned to a colleague and said, with unmistakable disbelief, "Wait, is that Ironwood? I thought she left the fighter track years ago." Voss, standing nearby, heard that exchange clearly and asked, according to a witness, exactly who Ironwood actually was. The visiting officer, still processing his own surprise, explained, briefly but unmistakably, that Ironwood was a call sign that belonged to one of the most respected combat pilots he'd ever flown alongside, a reputation built on missions that, in his specific professional community, were still referenced years later as an example of exactly what genuinely exceptional flying under pressure looked like. And then, according to that same witness, someone in the room, cross-referencing the transmission with the exercise's participant roster, made a connection that hit Voss with the exact force you'd expect. The pilot behind that call sign, flying that day as part of the visiting element, wasn't a stranger to that base at all. It was Sarah Kincaid, the same officer he'd dismissed in a planning meeting weeks earlier with a comment about women not typically flying that side of the house. I want you to picture Voss's face in that exact moment, because according to the witness who described it, it did something that several people in that room still bring up when they tell this story. Not embarrassment exactly, at least not immediately, genuine, stunned disbelief. The specific kind that comes from watching your own casually dismissive words get handed back to you in the most undeniable way possible. Sarah, over the following several minutes, coordinated the fraying formation back into order with exactly the kind of precision that had earned her that call sign years earlier, guiding the exercise through its remaining scenario with a level of tactical clarity that several evaluators monitoring the exercise afterward specifically flagged as some of the cleanest coordination they'd seen in that particular exercise series. Once the exercise wrapped and the participating aircraft returned to base, Voss, according to two witnesses, made a point of seeking Sarah out personally, finding her on the flight line still going through her post-flight routine. He didn't try to explain away or minimize what he'd said weeks earlier. He acknowledged it directly, telling her, according to one witness, that he'd clearly misjudged her badly and that he owed her a genuine apology, not just for the comment itself, but for not bothering to actually look into her background before making it. Sarah, according to that same witness, accepted the apology with the same understated composure she'd carried through the entire situation, telling him simply that she'd heard some version of that comment more times in her career than she cared to count, and that she appreciated him being direct about it now rather than letting it sit unaddressed. Word of what had happened moved through that base with the particular speed that stories involving a colonel's very public misjudgment tend to travel. In the weeks that followed, according to people stationed there, Sarah's actual background became considerably more widely known, and the casual, outdated assumptions that had apparently gone unchallenged around that base for years started, quietly but noticeably, becoming a great deal less common in general conversation. What stays with me most about this story isn't really the moment that call sign came over the radio, satisfying as it undeniably is. It's the years before it. Years of a genuinely exceptional combat pilot building a reputation that traveled quietly through a specific professional community while walking, most days, through rooms full of people who had absolutely no idea what she'd actually done, simply because her current role gave them no reason to look closer. She never once tried to correct Voss's assumption directly. She let her reputation, built over a career of real work, answer for her, exactly when it mattered most. So here's my question for you tonight, and I want your honest answer in the comments. Do you think Voss deserves genuine credit for apologizing as directly and immediately as he did once he understood the mistake? Or do you think the comment itself, regardless of the apology, reflects an assumption that should never have made it out of his mouth in the first place? And tell me the other thing too. Before I said her call sign, had you already started suspecting that Sarah was carrying a combat record considerably bigger than her current role suggested? If this story kept you here tonight, subscribe before you go, because this channel exists entirely for exactly this kind of story. Old assumptions meeting the exact reputation they never bothered to check first. And if you've got a story like Sarah's, tell me about it in the comments. I read every single one. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. I'll see you in the next one.